The Bogosity Podcast, early and ad-free. Become a subscriber at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Discord. Use the links at donate.bogosity.tv.
Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the week of May 26, 2024. The podcast that crystallized the Vale's broad slopes. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's tetanize the news of the bogus. So we're starting to get the Supreme Court decisions for a lot of the cases we've covered for this term, and we'll start out with a disappointing decision about asset forfeiture. The Supreme Court, as we covered, realized there's something definitely wrong here, but so far they've done nothing to put a stop to it. They have made some good rulings, like in Timms v. Indiana, a case of criminal asset forfeiture, where they said it was unconstitutional to seize assets worth more than the maximum fine for the offense. In that case, a sale of $260 worth of heroin, which has a maximum fine of $10,000, resulted in the forfeiture of a $42,000 Range Rover. The justices said this concept also applied to civil asset forfeiture, and since in civil asset forfeiture there generally aren't any charges filed, they just take the property, then logically any forfeiture would be an excessive fine because the applicable fine would be $0. Unfortunately, that was 5 years ago and it didn't change anything. And sadly, the case of Cully v. Marshall has ended in a loss for the two women who had their cars stolen by police. Hannah Cully had loaned her car to her son, who was pulled over by police and arrested for possession of marijuana. Lena Sutton loaned her car to a friend who was arrested for trafficking meth. Both women sued the state of Alabama, saying that officials violated their due process rights without holding hearings to decide if the seizure was warranted. The 11th Circuit had ruled that the Constitution required a timely forfeiture hearing, but doesn't require a separate preliminary hearing. In this case, timely meant more than a year. And sadly, the decision by Justice Kavanaugh seems to blame the victims, saying if you don't act fast enough and do the right things and hop on one leg at the right time, then the delays are your fault, even though you have things like a job in real life. I really don't understand the concurrence by Gorsuch, joined by Thomas. That is, I don't understand why it's a concurrence and not a dissent. They basically trashed the entire concept of civil asset forfeiture. Gorsuch wrote, "Often, the state's law enforcement agencies may take and keep private property without a warrant or any other form of prior process. Instead, only after taking the property must the agency file a civil forfeiture action in court. Once there, the agency need present only a prima facie case that the property in question represents proceeds traceable to a drug crime or property used to facilitate one. If the agency proves just that much, the burden sometimes shifts to the property's owner to prove she was an innocent owner who did not know about or consent to the conduct that caused the property to be taken. Should the agency prevail in the end, it may keep the property for its own use or sell it and keep the money." In other words, it's a very low standard of proof, and after that, the burden is shifted to the victim. Quote, "In part thanks to this asymmetry, civil forfeiture has become a booming business. In 2018, federal forfeitures alone brought in $2.5 billion. Meanwhile, according to some reports, these days up to 80% of civil forfeitures are not accompanied by a criminal conviction. Not only do law enforcement agencies have strong financial incentives to pursue forfeitures, those incentives also appear to influence how they conduct them. The 5th and 14th Amendments guarantee that no government in this country may take life, liberty, or property without due process of law. As originally understood, this promise usually meant that a government seeking to deprive an individual of her property could do so only after a trial before a jury in which it, not the individual, bore the burden of proof. Why does a nation so jealous of its liberties tolerate expansive new civil forfeiture practices that have led to egregious and well-chronicled abuses? Perhaps it has something to do with the relative lack of power of those on whom the system preys. Perhaps government agencies' increasing dependence on forfeiture as a source of revenue is an important piece of the puzzle. But maybe, too, part of the reason lies closer to home. In this nation, the right to a jury trial before the government may take life, liberty, or property has always been the rule. Yes, some exceptions exist, but perhaps it is past time for this court to examine more fully whether and to what degree contemporary civil forfeiture practices align with that rule and those exceptions. And then he disregards all of that as a question to be taken up at some unspecified moment in the future. With the 3 liberal justices dissenting, this makes 5 justices that have expressed the issues with this horrendous practice. That's a majority. Unfortunately, it's a majority that doesn't count. If you're looking for a way to support this channel, but you don't have any spare cash and you can't stand ads, you can do so by generating your own cryptocurrency. Use the links at the bottom of the description to follow the link to Odysee.com to listen to the podcast and see all of my YouTube videos as well. Just watching videos will produce cryptocurrency for the creator and yourself. And since Odysee is always monetized and never censored, you'll have no problem seeing all the videos from your favorite creators. You can also use the library credits you create at Odysee to tip creators and even purchase paid content. Earn library credits through various rewards, including daily view rewards and the number of shares and invites. And you can interact with creators in all sorts of ways, including like and dislike, comment, boost a post by supporting it, repost it, and share to other sites, all while earning crypto for the creator. Easily monetize yourself and your favorite creators using cryptocurrency without advertising. Use the link below to visit this channel on Odysee.com and see many of your other favorites there as well. So, who should have more say in what gets said at a graduation ceremony? The valedictorian or a billionaire? It looks like the University of Manitoba might be siding with the billionaire. Valedictorian Gem Newman gave a speech to his fellow graduates from the Max Rady College of Medicine in which he had the audacity to say that Israel was wrong for deliberately targeting hospitals in Palestine and calling for a ceasefire and the immediate resumption of humanitarian aid. He said, quote, "Israel's deliberate targeting of hospitals and other civilian infrastructure has led to more than 35,000 deaths and widespread famines and disease. I ask that you join me in calling for an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Palestine. Join me in calling for unrestricted humanitarian and medical aid in Gaza. I'm sure that some of you here today are worried that you might face censure for speaking out against the genocidal war that Israel is waging on the people of Palestine, that it could jeopardize your career before it's even begun. I understand that fear. Surely I don't have to remind any of you that advocacy is literally in our job description. It is never too late to join the right side of history." Ernest Rady, the son of the man for whom the college was named, hit the ceiling, calling the comments hate speech and said, quote, "Newman's speech not only dishonored the memory of my father, but also disrespected and disparaged Jewish people as a whole." Really? Complaining about what the government of Israel has done, which has even fostered the opposition of something like 35% of Jews living in Israel, is disrespecting and disparaging Jewish people as a whole? He also said, quote, "Those words are not political opinion. Advocating for the protection of one group of people while in the same breath calling for the destruction and elimination of another is not advocacy. It is hate." You might be wondering where he called for the destruction and elimination of anyone. So am I. Unfortunately, I can't check the speech itself because the U of M took it down. Newman said in a statement, quote, "Criticism of the actions of the Israeli government does not in and of itself constitute anti-Semitism. That accusation, which has been leveled not only at me but at countless others, is not only unserious, but it also serves to trivialize the regrettably very real instances of anti-Semitism that do occur. And, of course, Rady is bullying the university, quote, for failing to call out Gem Newman's words for what they are. The university is no better. So, if you do nothing, you're doing something wrong as well. And apparently, he thinks he should get his way because of his money. Quote, when I make a gift to an institution, I do it because I believe in that institution and I trust its governing body to do important, significant, and good work with that money. But in this instance, by remaining silent, I would be complicit. Those words are not political opinion. They are hate speech and they are lies. They espouse the same age-old prejudices about Jewish omnipotence and thirst for domination that have been used for centuries to justify the atrocities committed against this religious group. Having failed to vet the valedictorian speech in advance, I beg that the University of Manitoba step up and finally do the right thing. Take down the convocation video and do not repost it unless the valedictorian's entire speech is removed. Acknowledge that they were not only inaccurate, but flat out lies, that they were hurtful to the university's Jewish students and all people of the Jewish faith, and that the remarks do not have a place in any setting at the university. And apparently it worked because they did just that. But while they claim to be acting on behalf of the portion of students who were Jewish, the fact is, as a school of medicine, they're all doctors. So why shouldn't they be more in solidarity with their brethren at Doctors Without Borders, who, as we've covered, have been giving first-hand accounts of the attacks on their hospitals and emergency services in Palestine? If your site is triggered by a message of stop fighting and stop bombing hospitals, then maybe the rest of us aren't going to take you seriously when you accuse them of hate. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.pagosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass censors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.pagosity.tv. It's really all about freedom of speech, expressed in this country in the First Amendment, which may be coming more under attack as AI gives us greater and greater ability to simulate and, as a result, make fun of others. Of course, a lot of people don't like that, and aside from the people who are being made fun of, a lot of people are doing the election misinformation screeching, and of course that is going to happen. Is already happening, really, with an AI of European Parliament VP Michal Šimečka boasting of having rigged the election and politicians in India being endorsed by dead people. Of course, we're already seeing AI fakes of Trump and Biden, such as video of Trump kissing Anthony Fauci and Biden telling voters not to show up for the Democratic primary. The FCC, in fact, just mandated labeling of AI-generated content in political ads on TV and radio. But going any further than that is going to have serious First Amendment concerns. The National Conference of State Legislatures published a list of 18 bills in various states trying to prohibit the use of AI in one form or another. Most of them thankfully failed, but 4 of them have been enacted. And that's without any sort of First Amendment exception that could reasonably apply. Remember that the Supreme Court has said repeatedly that the First Amendment protects your right to be wrong, even your right to lie outright. Although you can still be sued civilly for any damages, states can't restrict or ban speech on that basis. That includes New York Times v. Sullivan, which protected political speech even when the statement was proven to be false or defamatory, and United States v. Alvarez, which said that lying about having been awarded a military medal was protected speech. So far, there's been no indication that any of these laws have been enforced, let alone challenged in court, but it doesn't seem like they'd hold up given Alvarez, and any misinformation law would likewise run afoul of Sullivan. There are all sorts of issues with this new wave of laws. For example, electioneering laws, which prohibit deepfake videos within, say, 30 days in the case of Texas, has already been struck down in Citizens United. Gag orders, also known as prior restraint, have also been rejected, but states such as California and Michigan are apparently trying anyway, allowing basically anyone to file a complaint and seek hearings and gags on candidates, despite the fact that false political speech is absolutely protected. A lot of them seem to be running afoul of even Hustler v. Falwell, trying to severely restrict parody and satire. And even though some mandatory disclaimer laws may be valid when restricted to political campaigns or paid political advertisements, they might be on shakier grounds when just done on social media for the lulz. It's really just politicians capitalizing on the moral panic over AI and using elections as a cover to control political speech. We already have laws against falsely pretending to be a public official, laws about right of publicity, defamation, and so on. Those easily apply to AI deepfakes, and it's hard to think of anything outside of that where legal action would be justified. And keep in mind that the deepfakes of Ron DeSantis, Kari Lake, Joe Biden, and many others were all very quickly caught and debunked, with no one being able to show any real harm that was done. Certainly nothing compared to the harm that would happen to free speech if these laws started being enforced. But more than political control, this is also about the alternative media, self-publishing, social networks, and now generative AI, giving people a much greater ability to produce content that easily competes with legacy media. And they've shown the horrible lengths they'll go to fight against that. Think back to the complaints of H.L. Mencken or even Thomas Jefferson. Fake news has always been with us. It's only fair that the people have the same power that elites do. Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-aged children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins. And now it's time to expatiate this week's biggest bogon emitter. Speaking of election misinformation, we go to Joe Biden talking about Trump supposedly calling for a unified Reich, and that Trump supposedly admitted to being a Nazi. Trump shared to his Truth Social account a video made by a random fan showing newspaper headlines predicting prosperity after a Trump victory. The fan used an After Effects template where you drop in headlines and images, and it places them inside the video as part of the newspapers. The basis of the templates are actual newspapers from the late 19th to early 20th centuries that had fallen into the public domain. The template itself includes headlines through the end of World War I, including changes in political alliances, violence erupting in various countries, and, of course, the obligatory Lipsum text. But if you watch it, you'd wonder what the hell the lefties were all screeching about until you find that they zoom in on this very blurry line item in the background reading, "Strength significantly increased by the creation of a unified Reich," left from one of the default news stories about the formation of the Reich that predates Hitler, from 1871 up to 1918 when Germany became a republic. But, of course, that didn't stop them from grabbing it and proclaiming that Trump endorsed the Third Reich. The Lincoln Project accused the president of, quote, openly copying Nazi language. ABC said the ad used language, quote, from Nazi Germany, and, quote, referenced Adolf Hitler, neither of which is the case. Bismarck would have been the leader referenced. CNN's Mandu Raju confronted random Republicans in Congress demanding that they answer for this. But we see those yokels coming. More seriously, though, Jamie Raskin said that Trump used an anti-Semitic dog whistle, and none other than Robert Reich himself said that this was more evidence of hidden Nazi symbology in the Trump campaign. I guess he hasn't looked at his last name recently. But most prominently of all, it was Joe Biden himself, within a matter of hours, who tweeted,
Donald Trump posted an ad echoing the language of Nazi Germany. He only cares about holding on to power. I care about you.
Okay, let's be fair. Biden himself almost certainly didn't write that. He has people. Here's Biden's actual comment on the matter.
Donald Trump posted an ad echoing the What? Where am I? Is it time for my pudding?
And that's totally his comments and not in any way an AI. Jeez, I am having way too much fun with this technology. Okay, seriously this time, his actual comments.
Wow. A unified Reich? That's Hitler's language. That's not America's.
It's called German, you dolt! German is Hitler's language. America's is English. Reich is the German word for prosperous. When applied to a country, it basically means government over the prosperous. It generally wasn't, as the Holy Roman Empire and the German Empire showed even before Nazi Germany, but that's what the word is. And again, that headline is in the template and was pulled from the time before World War I.
He cares about holding on to power. I care about you.
I'll let the history of this podcast's coverage of his administration speak for how seriously you should take that statement. I mean, only one of you raided the home of the other to try and stop him from being reelected. Besides, I don't think anyone who co-sponsored the Bail Reform Act and the 1994 crime bill, as well as opposing integration and working closely with known white supremacists, has any business trying to paint the other side as racist. Just don't waste your time looking for the so-called fact-checkers to set the record straight. Either way, taking some small, blurry, and fast-moving text in one corner of a fan video and making it into some sort of campaign statement is next-level unhinged, and we've still got over 5 months to go before the election. So all of that makes Joe Biden this week's biggest bogon emitter. I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Bogosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Bogosity.tv. let's ventriloquize this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
And for those of you looking at the show notes, no, that's not a typo for Benny Hill. First time I watched this guy, that was why. I thought it was a misprint in the TV listing and I wanted to watch the Benny Hill show. Instead, I get this crazy-ass faith healer guy, Benny Hinn. Yes, this was part of the faith healing craze among evangelicals, spurred on by figures such as Oral Roberts, Kenneth Copeland, Ernest Angley, and Peter Popoff. All of them, Hinn included, would not only tell people they were healed through Christ, but actively encourage them to throw their medicine away. The damage they did to these people's lives cannot even begin to be quantified, and yet they raked in millions, living in the lap of luxury, and Hinn was no exception. In fact, in 1993, Inside Edition found that, far from the modest lifestyle he claimed to live, his Orlando home was worth $685,000, more than $1.4 million in today's dollars. His miracle crusades were called into question by investigative reporters from the Los Angeles Times, NBC's Dateline, and 60 Minutes. HBO's documentary A Question of Miracles was given access to Hinn's ministry as well as others and followed up on the healings. And not only could they not find any cases where the person was actually healed, they found no interest by Hinn and the other faith healers of following up on any of them. Then, in 2004, the CBC's The Fifth Estate did a report on Hinn's ministry where they showed misappropriation of funds, outright fabrication, and how his staff chose the most vulnerable and desperate audience members to come on stage. And, of course, no amputees or anyone else with an obvious physical condition. Even his own nephew, Costi Hinn, described his uncle's ministry as, quote, arguably the most hateful and abusive kind of false teaching plaguing the church today. Overall, Hinn has amassed a net worth of $42 million. So Hinn has a lot to apologize for, but in an interview with the Strang Report, he could only apparently think of two. One was his focus on the prosperity gospel in the vein of Jimmy Swaggart, Robert Tilton, and Jim Baker as lampooned in the Genesis song and video Jesus He Knows Me. And the other was false prophecy, quote, I had guests come to the Crusades that I think brought harm not only to people's lives, but also to my reputation because their prophecies were not really prophecy. They went outside the borders of redemption. And then there were times when I thought God had showed me something that he wasn't showing me, and I spoke it out. But in 1 Corinthians 13, we clearly see that we all see prophecy in part. That means that we don't see the full picture. And sadly, and I wish I could go back and fix it, but sadly, there were some prophecies I gave that were not accurate or from the Lord. Oh, I remember one in particular I was especially disgusted by. In 1999, he went on Trinity Broadcasting Network and promised a miracle. God gave him a vision promising the resurrections of thousands of dead people. And all you had to do was lay your hands on the screen and think of the dead loved one you'd want to see brought back by Jesus. He also predicted that God would destroy all homosexuals no later than 1995, that Fidel Castro would die in the 90s, and that the rapture would happen before the end of the century. So what does he have to say about all that? Quote, but who's perfect? And of course he had to follow that up with, quote, but you know, it's sad when people focus on the times you missed it. But that's just, the way it is. Yet there were times when I did not miss it. Oh yeah? When? 'Cause people looked and they couldn't find any. And the most unbelievable part of it all is how many people still believe. So all of that makes Benny Hinn this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
Well, that wraps up this. The secret is not just to be stunning, which I find comes rather easily, to be honest. The tricky thing is getting exactly the right level of stun for the occasion edition of the Bogosity Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at the Discord or at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Christopher Hitchens. It's a matter of principle. If Jews born in Brooklyn have a right to a state in Palestine, then Palestinians born in Jerusalem have a right to a state in Palestine. The Bogosity Podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.